Hello, this is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David, a live stream broadcast I've been doing every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday during the pandemic, as long as I can't travel and play music for a living anymore. I'm also broadcasting on Mondays and Tuesdays. Mondays, I host Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, which anyone with a song, poem, or rant is encouraged to sign up for at davidrovix.com/POMM. Tuesdays, I host Fifth Estate Live, produced by Peter Werby. All of these live stream broadcasts start at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT every weekday. And you can find them both live and in archived form on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and my own Facebook pages and channels on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, VK, and LinkedIn. If you go to davidrovix.com or search on any podcasting platform for the podcast This Week with David Rovix, you can also find these programs in audio form soon after they are broadcast live. Another place you can find the broadcasts, along with lots of free content, as well as content reserved only for patrons, such as my 16-part audio memoir, is at patreon.com/davidrovix. That's also where you can support my various musical and non-musical efforts at Popular Education. Today's guest has been a local here in Portland, Oregon since he left Minneapolis in the early 1990s. Mike is a fantastic hip-hop artist who has recorded a whole bunch of albums and a lot of really good videos on YouTube, which I've just been very much enjoying once again since I got up this morning. He has recorded with other hip-hop artists who you may have heard of, such as Dead Prez, and he's toured in various formations in many different parts of the world, including all over Africa. Since 2015, he's been co-manager of Cable Community Radio just off Burnside Boulevard here in Portland. Mike, welcome to my little live stream show. Great to have you here.
Welcome, man. Thank you, David.
You know, there's way too many things we could talk about to start out with, such as what we were just talking about before we actually went live. But I mean, reading up on your history and also hearing that wonderful presentation that you gave for the high school class that we both gave presentations for a couple weeks ago on Zoom. You know, it struck me that, I mean, stuff I didn't know, first of all, but in the early 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was more or less in the New York area, and in Europe, the Berlin Wall was falling, and there was a huge rise in anti-immigrant and racist attacks in Germany. And there was this kind of like, there's this connection between cities in the U.S. and cities in Germany where this kind of similar things were playing out. And you were kind of on the ground floor of this in Minneapolis. And one of the, according to Wikipedia, one of the founders of the group Anti-Racist Action, which is probably one of the most popular patches on the backs of punk rockers around the world, and you know, ARA along with ACAB. And I wonder if we could just start there, and can you talk about what was going on in Minneapolis when you moved there and before you left, which was quite a momentous period, it sounds like.
Yeah, I was born on the south side of Chicago, lived there in my youth. We moved around a lot in Illinois. My mother had divorced my father, so she was a single mom with my brother and I, and then she remarried. And eventually we moved to Minneapolis, St. Paul in the 80s. So we lived in St. Paul first. And then in 85, we moved across the river to Minneapolis. And I lived on the north side, historically Black neighborhood, still predominantly Black, facing gentrification like many communities across the country. But I lived on the north side, but I bused to the south side to South High School. And it was in South High School that I began to become curious about the hardcore punk scene and met some friends, other people who didn't fit in. I didn't fit in much because I moved around too much. So the people I found to fit in with were the misfits. And that was when I got introduced to the hardcore punk scene. And through, a series of relationships, I became friends with a brother, Native American, Puerto Rican, Black brother by the name of Jay Nevels. And he was a skinhead. And at that particular time in my life, I needed to hang out with some people who weren't getting high and drunk. because I'd run into some issues with abuse and drugs and alcohol. And
So
so
he was a Sharpie, like a straight edge Sharpie skinhead, or
well, so here's what we'll talk about. I mean, I know I'm probably giving you too many details. Maybe I should.
No. We got an
Okay,
hour
so,
here. It's
okay.
That's why I like the hour-long format. We got a little time.
So Jay was a skinhead, and when I met him, he was more on the skate. He was straight edge, and he was a skater, but he was also like down with hip hop, and he was really into writing, and he used to carry the Magnum marker. So he was this mix of different things that were really appealing to me, because me coming from the Black community, knowing that somebody got and understood hip hop was important. Now, the punk scene was mostly white. There were some people of color in it, and Jay was one of them. So Jay and I became friends, and there was a small group of us, and we were all skinheads. Now, the term sharp emerged in the 90s, Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice, but our clique actually predated Sharp. We didn't find out about Sharp until maybe a year or so into what we were already doing. It's an important distinction, because Sharp has skinheads. Sharp as an acronym is Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. Shout out to Sharp. There are chapters all over the world, but what we were doing was done before anyone had come up with that term. That said, we were explicitly anti-racist, and we identified as skinheads, which some people, there's many different kinds of skinheads. There's the bald punk kind of skinhead. It's really just a punk rocker with a bald head. There's traditional skinheads that wear a very specific uniform, and within that uniform, there's different, types of shirts and suspenders and boots and shoes and pants and all that. And then there's the politicized, I guess, kind of range from ultra right-wing neo-Nazi skinheads to very radical leftist oriented anti-racist skinheads. So what the history of the skinhead subculture was created by Black West Indian migrants who were coming to England to look for opportunity and to improve their lives. And they brought their music and their style. And when they mixed with working class white kids, there became this emergence of the two cultures mixing, and that was the two-tone culture. And the music was ska, which was Jamaican rocksteady reggae with English rock influence. And these kids were all hanging out together and doing things together. In that time, that was in the late 60s, early 70s, similar to what we see today. There was a lot of xenophobia and scapegoating in Britain of immigrants, and a few different things happened while the British movement and the National Front, the ultra right-wing political parties in England, were targeting immigrants and blaming them for the country's economic woes. Reggae music coming out of Jamaica and the West Indies, and even in England, was starting to identify with the Black Power movement, and was starting to get more political. And so as the reggae music began to instill more Pan-African and political and Black liberation ideologies in the Black population in England, there was this simultaneous reaction where a lot of working class white kids would say things like, well, if they can be about their pride and about their culture and about their self-determination, well, we should be about ours. And England is actually for English and not for all these immigrants. So there was a split in which a lot of working class white rage went to the right. And the way some of that looked was some of the skinhead movement actually became Nazi skinheads. And the movement was splitting at that time. And then other skins remained traditional or two-tone skins, what some people would call Trojan skins, because Trojan was a record label that put out a lot of skinhead reggae. So that's the history of what happened in England. And in the late 70s and 80s, people in the punk scene in the United States, some of whom might have been to England or knew somebody, or people might have been coming from England that were skinheads over to the East Coast. So skinheads started to emerge in this country. And by the time my friends and I became skinheads, we had a little catching up to do. We became skinheads in the 80s. '80s, and we had to study the history of the movement and the culture because we wanted to do it right. And that's when we understood that you didn't have to be racist, that anybody that wasn't white could also participate in this culture. And so we became an explicitly anti-racist skinhead crew called the Minneapolis Baldies.
Mm-hmm.
There were 7 of us at first. We grew to a core group of about 33, and the extended family, we probably had, maybe 70, 80 people that were part of our movement in Minneapolis. And the reason it became a movement was because in the '80s, there was a lot of talk show sensationalism and mainstream media sensationalism of the Nazi skinhead problem that was emerging across the United States. And what that created in our communities was a lot of white kids who saw Nazis on TV. They thought they were tough. They thought they were macho. As a lot of pubescent boys, adolescent boys want something to belong to, something to feel cool, something to prove they're tough. And so white kids across America started signing up and becoming neo-Nazi skinheads. And so we saw an explosion of this in our own community, and we were like, no, there's no way we're not going to tolerate this. And so we began to confront. There was a Klan leader by the name of Paul Hollis who was a skinhead, and he recruited a bunch of white kids from all over the Twin Cities metro area, most heavily from East St. Paul. And they had a gang called the White Knights, and they would come hang out in Minneapolis at Uptown where all the punks hung out, and they would start coming to shows. And so my group, the Minneapolis Baldies, decided that we had to confront them. And
just a moment to context here. East St. Paul is like the poorest, whitest, working class neighborhood in the Twin Cities. Just right. That's just for people who are not familiar with it. Yep. Yeah. Please continue.
Yeah, and so these guys were coming to shows and intimidating people, attacking people of color, attacking gay and lesbian people. And my crew was like, we can't tolerate this. We gotta step to them. And so we found them and we confronted them and we said, look, are you guys the White Knights? Are you white power? And they were like, yeah, and we were like, well, that's not actually gonna fly over here. And we're gonna give you, we had a strategy. Our strategy was to say, the next time we see you, we're gonna check in with you again. We didn't start with violence. We gave them a choice. We kind of gave them an ultimatum. We said, if we see you again and you're still claiming white power, there's going to be a problem. And so that was the beginning of a violent confrontational period in my life where we were fighting them on sight every time we saw them. And they tried to grow and expand their movement so they would be more of an intimidating fighting force and have more of a fighting chance to exist. And as they tried to expand their movement, we expanded our movement. And that was the beginning of anti-racist action, which was actually at first, it was a unified group of different subcultural identities. Like there were punk rockers, and there was an organization called the Revolutionary Anarchist Bowling League, and a lot of those Rabble was down with us. They were fighting Nazis with us. There were different gang formations in Minneapolis, from Black and Latinx, Native American gangs, and street organizations that joined us. And so that was the beginning of anti-racist action. And I remember, I think it was my good comrade Kieran Knudsen who coined the term anti-racist action, because it was clear we believed that direct action was the only effective tool against fighting violent white supremacists.
And this basic idea of direct action to fight violent white supremacists just became a meme at the time and spread all over the place in terms of it was like one of these things where I don't think I would guess that probably 99% of people with ARA patches on their jackets have never attended an ARA meeting, but they identify with the idea of fighting white supremacists. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty horizontal and decentralized movement. It was like the ideology of direct action against racist is not new, right?
No.
we can think, what was it? Was it the Greensboro massacre where members of the Communist Party,
Communist Labor Party were
Communist
killed,
Labor
yeah,
Party?
by the Klan.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And but there was a meme that came out of that, death to the Klan, you know. And I've seen that meme with the silhouette of a Klansman hanging from a noose, you know, and I've seen that tattooed on people. I've seen the Wheels of Soul motorcycle club out of started in Camden, New Jersey, but actually it's headquartered in Philadelphia and is a national club.
This is a national club. What's it called? Wheels of Soul?
Wheels of Soul MC. They use that. They brand that meme. I think on at least one of the clubhouses, there's the death to the Klan.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And so, you know, these ideas are basically rooted in, I think it's rooted in the characteristics that a lot of people have, that we don't want racial terror to be part of our society, you know, and the fact that you don't want it there is not enough, because racial terror exists. It's a militant form of violence. It's a violent ideology, you know. It's people who are aligned with it are killers, and they have been since the history of this country has been in existence. Racial terror has been used to keep us in our places. And so the need to respond against that, whether it's Nat Turner or John Brown, that's something that's age old, you know. And I think there's an effort sometimes to brand things, to oversimplify them and to put them in a box and say, well, that's what that is. And once you do that, it's very easy for people to begin to actually misunderstand and to start to scapegoat and marginalize something, depending on what demagogues say about it. And what I'm moving towards is Antifa, you know?
Right. And the way that this Antifa has been sort of turned into this, like, I mean, I'm not sure what to call this in Trump's mind, what it is, but I think he was very upset about the positive attention in the media that Antifa got after Charlottesville, for one thing.
Well, yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things that neo-Nazis and white supremacists hate almost more than they hate Black people and people of color and Jews and anyone else that they target, they hate white people that they consider to be race traitors. And in some cases, they're going to go harder on whites that they consider to be race traitors. That's like the primary target. It's like that's the biggest betrayal in the mind of a racist, is a white person who would align themselves with the anti-racist.
I heard about especially savage beatings for the Southern white anti-racists in taking part in civil rights marches. Like would be targeted for that. I don't know how we measure the savagery of the beatings, but but they were not spared.
Yeah,
they said.
Right. I guess they didn't have an app back then.
A savagery meter.
The things you laugh about in the crazy world, right? Jesus, man, we were talking before we went live. Just you asked me how I'm doing, and I was.
Let's skip to the present moment. We can move back to Minneapolis later.
Okay.
If you want, I mean, how would you? I mean, I've been asking people just this is what seems like a simple question, but it's not. Like, how would you even describe the present historical moment that we're in?
Ah, man, this moment is the paradigm shift. Sometimes you don't want to speak too soon,
right?
Because you have to let things develop, and I feel more alive than I've felt in a really long time. And I think it's because what I'm processing is the convergence of these different shifting factors and emerging possibilities that for the first time in my lifetime, I think is experienced on a universal level. I don't know what it was like to be alive in the World War I era, the World War II era, or the Great Depression. But what I can say is that this global pandemic has coincided with what some of us could look at as late stage neoliberal capitalism, in that the means of production for goods and services and industry has been underway. The shift to automation has been underway since the 70s. And what that's done is it's caused a lot of countries that were considered first world countries. But no, let's talk about United States of America. The United States of America working class has been slowly witnessing the vanishing entitlement of comfort and security and stability that was the result of years of consolidated wealth, right? And the automation of labor was one of those forces, because why would I pay a human being a fee to do for me what I can get a machine to do for free, right? If it takes a person 8 hours to create something that a machine can create in a matter of seconds, and you don't have to pay the pension, the medical, the dental, the sick leave, and all that, you're going to go with the machine. That's what capitalism does.
Or export your industry to a country where you can exploit sweatshop labor, or some combination of the two, but you end up with a totally unemployed former working class, you know.
Exactly. So the globalization of labor and the automation of labor is happening, and that's driving policy, right? But how it looks on the streets is people are like going, well, I used to think that I was going to be able to, pay my kids way through college and have a home, and people are like having to work 4 jobs if they can even get a job. Now we're in a gig economy, and people are doing anything we can to make a buck, and we don't have any. There's no social safety net for so many people. So that said, that's running concurrent with escalating violence and increased suffering.
And this is not a coincidence, right? I mean, I like to point out to people that and whether or not it's, I mean, I have nothing to prove that this is related, but I mean, just Portland, Oregon is the most rent-burdened city in the United States in terms of the income relative to how much they charge for rent. And it also another statistic in Portland, Oregon, is the city has lost more than half of its Black population in the past 20 years. Another statistic is at some years, the Portland Police Department kills more Black men per capita than any other police department in the United States. These are 3 statistics, and they stand side by side, and I can't say that they're all directly related, but they would seem to be.
But everything is interconnected. Everything is interrelated. We live in a system of interdependent realities, right? Just like the sun shines, right? And in order for the sun to shine on the earth, there's going to be photosynthesis in the plants, and now we have some food to eat or whatever. It's like what we do on this planet is connected to larger systems that were in existence before we were born and will be here long after we die. And the same thing is true of the society that we live in, and the areas of human activity: food, clothes, shelter, education, healthcare, peace, land, politics, religion, war. All these things are interrelated, right? So I say that to say that in this moment, everything is transforming, because the ways that people created, generated, consolidated wealth is controlled by different things. So that the people who used to go to work, the ways that they would earn money have changed too, or the amount of money that's available for the worker has been shifted in such a way that your standard of living is actually going down. Your life expectancy. I watched it.
Down.
When I was a kid in high school, the environmental science teacher was saying that by this time our life expectancy would be up to like 110 years or something.
Yeah,
but
right.
I'm watching people die in their 30s and 40s of things that used to have to be 70 or 80 to die of.
Yep.
And so, like, I'm not trying to ignore what happened in Minneapolis. But what we understand, that what happened with the George Floyd murder is part of a continuum, and it didn't happen in a vacuum. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, the brother who just got killed in the Wendy's parking lot, in Atlanta. I think it's Rayshard Brooks.
Yeah, Rayshard Brooks. But
I mean, go ahead.
But I was wondering, like, I mean, when I was reading about your history in Minneapolis with ARA and stuff, like, I mean,
Right.
what did Minneapolis have a particularly large Nazi scene? Because I mean, this was Portland did. I mean, Portland. Which was also, I was also curious about your move to Portland, because I mean, Portland, one of the things that Portland was particularly known for, at least in some circles in the 80s, was pitched battles between Nazis and anti-Nazis in the various neighborhoods, and the killing of an Ethiopian man whose name
Mulugeta Sarah.
Yes, just a few blocks from where I am right now. Yeah.
Right, Southeast Portland. So to compare the two cities, Minneapolis was the whitest city per capita in the 80s, and then Portland became the whitest city. So the ratio of people who were identified as white or of European descent were so proportionately in the majority that these cities were the whitest per capita. And I'm not really sure why I wound up in the whitest city and then moved to the second whitest city, and then that became the first whitest city. And then I think at some point, Omaha, Nebraska took the trophy. So I don't know where the whitest city is now. But what I will say is that since the 80s, Minneapolis has become more diverse, although it's still a very white city. There's been a lot of migrant populace from East Africa, from North Africa.
One of our viewers currently is in Somaliland, incidentally, and he says hello.
Hey,
Muhammad Hassan.
What's up, Muhammad Hassan? How you doing, bro? Good to be connected, man. We're good Facebook friends, and you know, I met Muhammad when he lived in Portland, and we were both part of Education Without Borders.
So. And you've traveled a lot and organized other tours all over Africa. And this hip hop caravan, it sounds amazing. I was wondering if you could tell us a little about that. But I mean, too many things to talk about. But
I know. Well, let's wrap up. So yeah. Minneapolis, St. Paul had a Nazi presence because the Minneapolis Baldies and Anti-Racist Action confronted that Nazi presence. It was forced underground, but it never left completely. But they were no longer comfortable to show up in public in the ways that they had been prior to our level of direct action. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now
right.
what I understood about Portland at that time was that sometimes the majority of people at punk rock shows would be Nazis and Nazi sympathizers, and that if you weren't a Nazi, it wasn't a very safe place, a very safe environment. And there were fanzines, magazines that were grassroots in their origin, like Maximum Rock and Roll and other ways that the hardcore punk scene across the United States would communicate. There would be what we call scene reports in a section of the magazine where different cities would talk about what was going on in their scenes. And that's how we in Minneapolis learned that Portland had a bad Nazi problem. East Side White Pride was out here. American Front was organizing up here. These are different white supremacist gangs and organizations. White Aryan Resistance was up here. And it turns out that when Mulugeta Sarah got murdered, when he got beat to death with a bat, I think that was 88, that it was some neo-Nazis, some members of the East Side White Pride gang that had beat him to death. And in the wake of that, there was Coalition for Human Dignity. There were local chapters here in Portland of Anti-Racist Action and SHARP, Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice, and a lot of different formations, and people were mobilized by that murder, and they wanted to come out here and try to help support the anti-racist organizing that was happening. So there was a series of events and conferences in the wake of Mulugeta Sarah's death. Prior to that, Minneapolis Baldies sent a cohort out here, and they did built some alliances with some of the street level anti-racist activity. And so by the time I moved here, I came out here in 90, and that was during the Mulugeta Sarah trial. It was a big deal. Morris D's big
Mm.
big lawyer from Southern Poverty Law Center. You know, Tom Metzger was on trial. It was on the news. You know, it was a big deal. It was a
Big national
national
story.
story, right? And war lost. White Aryan
White Aryan
resistance
Resistance, yeah, and
lost.
then they dissolved as an organization, I guess. Huh?
Correct. But Tom Metzger's still around doing his thing somewhere in California.
Right.
And so here's what I learned looking back over the years. You can beat a Nazi with a bat. You can hit him with a brick. You could even, shoot a Nazi and kill him. But white supremacy does not leave because you killed somebody.
Right.
You know, and in some cases, people who are committed to these kinds of ideologies already have a victim mindset.
Right.
And you're just, in some cases, those of us who identify with whatever our warrior framework is, when people come at us, it just strengthens our resolve. I say that to say, I'm not saying we should not engage in direct action against white supremacists. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the root causes of why.
Yeah, that doesn't get addressed by street fighting. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and yeah, there's way too many places to go, but I can't. But we've been talking about this stuff for half an hour, and I want to talk about music a bit if we can. Yeah. Although I want to talk for several more hours about other subjects. But can you tell us about what is the how did you end up in sending computers to Burundi, and how did you end up first going there?
So it really goes back to Minneapolis again. I got my start in political organizing as a youth, being involved in anti-racist action. That activity caused adults in the community to take notice. So elder revolutionaries and educators and activists began to take an interest in my political development, and in doing so, I was actually recruited and became a member of the Communist Labor Party. And what that involved really was a lot of reading and a lot of studying.
Oh yeah.
and that
Marx wrote a lot of books. Thick stuff.
Well, and even just learning about our own working class struggle in the United States of America, different sectors of the working class, the Black working class, the struggle of auto workers in Detroit to organize and become a force. There are so many different historical strands that I began to learn about, and it began to place me and my life and my choices in the context of history. And that was good, because as a kid, I thought me and my friends were the only ones who were woke. We didn't have that word back then, by the way, but we felt like we were the only ones who were doing something. And so for those adults to step in and play a role in my development was really integral into the human being that I am today, because they taught me how to think critically and how to examine, how to have an historical analysis, and how to look at the root causes of the things that show up in society. And that led to me doing a level of activism that showed up later when I moved to Portland, Oregon, and met a good friend of Muhammad and mine, Dan Shea, because Dan Shea was part of Veterans for Peace. And I was doing some work with the American Friends Service Committee, Quaker organization involved in a lot of different human rights and justice struggles. And so we together were going into high schools and doing counter recruitment work. And we were letting students and educators know that they could opt out of military recruiters having their access to their personal information, their test scores. Because the military recruiters were targeting people with low test scores and low income. And so there was this kind of like passive aggressive poverty draft that's like present in the high schools. And to high school kids who are uneducated, they see these guys come in with their uniforms, and some of them have nice cars, and they're promising they're going to get free college and this, that, and the other. But we know the reality is that you're just harvesting more bodies for the military industrial complex. And it was through that work, that counter recruitment work, that I was invited to go to a conference in Rwanda in 2004 that was sponsored by the AFSC. And that was a conference on genocide reconciliation, HIV/AIDS, economic justice, and youth empowerment. And one of the conditions of me participating in the conference was that I had to come up with a project that would be a 2-year commitment related to the outcomes of the conference in Rwanda. So that was my first time in Africa. It was life-changing. I met over 60, 70 activists and educators, people just like me, artists, committed to the survival of the people on the ground in the countries and communities that they came from in Africa. There were people there from Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Zimbabwe. Obviously, our hosts were in Rwanda. There were people from Burundi, and there were activists there who wanted to start a project collectively that would help East African orphaned children, people who've been orphaned by the genocide, people who were facing multi-generational abject poverty, become computer literate. At that time, this was 10 years after the Rwandese genocide that happened in 1994. So at the time, in Rwanda specifically, they had the largest per capita population of people under 35, because so many young people had been orphaned by their parents, perishing in the genocide 10 years prior. So I met thousands of, I met hundreds of kids, but I met people who work with thousands of young people who weren't having even just the access to the type of stability that would come from having a family intact, and they asked if I could help them build a computer center to help some of these kids become computer literate. The two of the activists who, Jean-Claude Kundwa, and I'm forgetting the other brother's name, but they were from Burundi, which is the neighboring country of Rwanda. So a lot of the ethnic strife and the refugees fleeing that, a lot of what had happened in Rwanda spilled over into Burundi. And I was asked to help them build a computer center in Burundi to serve some of the youth there. And so that was my 2-year project. And I came back to Portland, Oregon, and went about organizing, and Free Geek helped donate some computers, started a company called Global Fam with my good friend and comrade Morgan Delaney, who was a high school teacher. And we got the computers from Free Geek, and we raised a lot of money through a hip hop concert with Dead Prez to ship the computers. And at that point, so that was, our organization is called Global Fam. And that's the imprint that I still put my music out under today, Global Fam Entertainment. But at that time, it was Education Without Borders was our fiscal sponsor. And so I'm currently still a member of Education Without Borders. And that the work that I did in Rwanda, which helped build the computer center in Burundi, is what got me invited to play a music festival in Zimbabwe in 2012. One of my comrades who was at the conference in Rwanda invited me, and I played Zimbabwe in 2012. And it was there I met people who were organizing the African Hip Hop Caravan. They knew about the computer center, and so they were excited to invite me into the project as an organizer. And they gave me a couple of tasks to come back and get some support for the project in the United States. So once again, I come back here with a mission that's been designed by my African comrades, right? And to me, it's in that time I'm starting to, I'm in my late 20s and early 30s, I think, and I'm starting to realize the global nature of this interconnectedness and these movements and efforts for human rights and justice and anti-oppression work. To make sure that people's lives have a chance to develop, to reach a liberatory kind of potential in the world where the dominant systems are operating in such a way in our lives that we're limited, and that's so central to what I've been up to ever since I was a kid. And ultimately, David, that's what fuels the lyrical content of the music. Like, since this thing has been going down with the pandemic, I've had a chance to slow down And then when George Floyd got murdered, it gave me a chance to really reflect on the work I've been doing as an artist. And I realized what I've known the whole time in my being, but I realized it in a different way. And that is that 90% of the songs I've written for 30 years are about this moment.
Right? You've been working up to this.
Yeah. Yeah. This is what I've been pushing for. I was born for this, man.
We've been talking about defunding the police for a long time, huh?
Yeah. You know,
it's really quite something to hear this as a mainstream talking point, and I mean,
God.
you know, it's just it's hard to get my head around. Although they're defining it in the most bizarre and narrow and ways that are not as intended by the people using the phrase in the streets, but it's still it's being talked about, and it's really quite something.
Yeah, indeed. And for me to listen, I remember, NPR used to have things that were remotely left, right? Or even radical. Maybe it would be late at night. Remember,
yeah, right.
Mumia Abu-Jamal had his thing that he would do live from Death Row, right? And so that said, it's become this like centrist, like safety zone that's like, pro-Zionist and sponsored by some of the same companies that participate in the military industrial complex and blah blah blah. So I say that to say that for me to turn on NPR and 24 hours a day be able to hear people talking critically about white supremacy and systemic racism is good.
Yeah.
It would not have happened without a people's movement, uprising, and rebellion against a historic plague that we've been facing,
I mean, because it's not a coincidence that it happens at the same time as this pandemic, which has just exposed so many inequities and caused so many more. It's really, but then it gets to like, so exactly what is the nature of this powder keg, because it's not exactly clear, you know what I mean? It's like, there's a lot of things going on here.
There is a lot of things. And it's, I remember the first time I rode a motorcycle, it was scary because you realize if you've driven a car and you're used to having a metal box around you and built-in safety contraptions like seat belts and so you realize how vulnerable you are, and it takes a lot for your senses, your peripheral vision, your sense about it takes a lot for you to kind of snap into being a defensive driver when you're that vulnerable. And so that said, the sense of aliveness that I'm feeling right now that's invigorating is I feel like the environment is shifting in that I'm having to use more of my consciousness than I did previously to figure out what's on the horizon and what's in my periphery, because I can't tell what the outcome of any of this is going to be, and none of us can. So we're in the streets, we're protesting, we're doing demonstrations. There's more people mobilized than I've seen in a long time, maybe ever. When I'm driving from one end of Portland to the other, I'm seeing in total sometimes hundreds of white people on corners holding signs saying Black Lives Matter. And those people be out there all day. Maybe there are peak periods where there's more people than other times, but I've never seen that. The amount of awareness and urgency, again, in this frame, in this context, this broader kind of like environment where people don't even know when they're going to be able to go back to work, if they're going to be able to go back to work. So the precarious nature of that is like, on the one hand, it's allowed us to think about like what we can actually walk away from. So like, if I don't have to commute and I can just work from home, why would I ever choose to commute again? Right?
Yeah, so a lot of people will probably not be commuting, and there's a lot of, I mean, they're predicting 85% of the restaurants in the country might end up closing for good. I mean, it's really like, it's hard to get your, I mean, I find I'm just constantly listening to many different news sources. I constantly have something in my ear, you know, because
Right,
and I'm a news junkie normally, but
right.
like just since the pandemic hit, I find it's impossible to keep up on what's going on, even when you're good at that. You know?
Yeah, yeah. And then so like there's consuming media, right? I have to sometimes make a disciplined effort, you know, to pull away from my screen, to put my
Yeah,
phone down, you know,
mental
to
health.
mental health, man, spiritual health. And but at the same time, if you go outside, you're like looking at the environment and you're looking at the people and you're understanding like things are different now. Things have changed, and where we're going, nobody is sure. One of the things that concerns me the most is I sense that there's a wave of repression
Right.
that that is already emerging,
It's
right?
kind of easy to sense, right? I mean,
Right.
when you see, what did you think? Speaking of wave of repression, though, I mean, just like
Mhm.
I mean, what's been one of the things it's this is not new, but every time, I mean, the police have been attacking people for taking over streets and calling this like, you know, this is what seems to fall into their definition of violent
Right.
protest, you know?
Right.
And so it has to be attacked with tear gas and all this kind of stuff. But then when there's buildings on fire, generally the police are absent, which is,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a long-standing tradition. And then of course in Minneapolis they're on camera puncturing tires, you know. But
Man.
really, this is all part of their general MO. But it seems to be like they're building for repression. They're trying to make this, you know, as big as it possibly can be, actually, you know, trying to attack people, which then of course will get some people to fight back and then leave the scene when when anybody starts setting buildings on fire. I mean, it's just classic, you know, sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I'm like, is this just foreplay? Like when does the real fucking begin? You know,
Oh
and
yeah.
and that's what I'm worried about, you know, and I don't want fear to uh become something that paralyzes me or makes me unhealthy. But I want to be careful about how do I take this awareness and turn it into something that's actually effective, not just for
Yeah.
protecting my life and the lives of those around me, but so that our community can have a consciousness and a collective awareness about us. As far as
What are your thoughts?
I'm I I'm not having answers yet, David. I'm not, you know, there's some things that I can't talk about here, but I will say that community defense is something that I've been engaged with in different various ways and tactics, you know, and approaches since I was a kid. And so looking at starting simple, like okay, physical proximity, who do I have in my area that I can trust, that I have relationships with, that I can rely on, that I can support or who can support me. Um, who in my area do I need to be careful of? Who in my area do I know or am I curious about, but maybe need to make some steps towards getting to know them? As far as
Mm,
just thinking about the radius around my damn house, right? But then community uh, also exists in a term that's not defined by physical proximity, right? So people who I can rely on that might not be my neighbors who might live across town, but who I have a relationship with that is a little bit deeper, and so that as things escalate, the level of tools that I might need to access um, needs to be something that's coordinated. So these type of things are things that we don't want to have to think about. But what was the Bruce Lee meme I saw? He said, you know, how can you be a proponent of peace and be a martial artist? And he said, it's better to be a warrior in the garden, than a gardener in the war. You know, and it's like
mm,
I want to be ready, and I want to be among people who are ready, because we're going to be able to protect ourselves, and ultimately, once we move out of the reactive defensive stage and get into proactive assertion of what we
mm.
wanted, the type of world and community we want to live in, which is really what we need to be always working on anyway. I want to be around the kind of people who I can have faith in, and who, the type of people who are going to be engaged in accountability, mutual accountability, where they can hold me accountable, I can hold them accountable, but we know we're all holding ourselves accountable. You know, there's a law or a code that I developed over the years, being engaged in direct action in the type of street activity I was in, and that is, you know, you don't go to jail, don't go to the graveyard, and don't kill yourself. And that's just about getting home safe, you know. And it's also about, you know, carry yourself in a way where, you know, you have people that would, if you had to do something that would put you in prison for life, you could call them and they would have your back. But the whole key to it is, don't put yourself in a position where you have to call them, you know. And so there's a lot there that's, you know, I think more oriented to the type of things that happen that don't get talked about than and that's like one pole. That's an important level of consciousness. There's some integrity there that I think is integral to the type of mindset that we have to have as survivors. But at the same time, there's the more kind of public face of what political activism looks like. And some people might identify a contradiction, and they might say, well, like, you know, taking a rest for the movement is a very, you know, that's a tactic, and you can't be afraid to go to jail when you're fighting for freedom. And the goal is not to go to jail, you know, but if the level of how effective your work is one that you become a target and you wind up being in prison for that, then that might be a consequence of doing this work. Because the work that we're doing, we're actually working against a system that their only way of dealing with us is to try to silence us, you know, to try to put us away so we don't have access, so we don't have physical freedom, or to try to put us in the ground, to try to take our very lives. And so that's how, this isn't a game. I mean, it's easy to think like when we're posting on social media and people are blowing up on each other on threads or over disagreements over semantics and ideology.
Yeah.
That's not reality.
No.
It's expression in a sphere that's actually controlled by the same people who are mining your data for digital surveillance. And I just heard that Facebook is a major contributor to the Trump campaign now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Now that they've censored his latest fascist ad, they felt like they had to contribute to his campaign. Perhaps I don't know,
man. You know, we live in a strange world, and so at some point I don't think it's a matter of if, I think it's a matter of when. I think 3 protesters were run over a few days ago here in Portland. I just saw last night somebody got killed by a FedEx driver who was driving in St. Louis.
Yeah, these car attacks are becoming more and more common, which is just strikes me as a bit bizarre in a country as well armed as the United States. You know you can see why people. I mean, you know, if somebody's wanting to commit mass murder, you can see why they would use a car in a place like Europe where it's hard to get an automatic weapon. But I don't know. I mean, this is. I'm not trying to be funny. It's just. No, it's just, but the shootings of protesters and car attacks on protesters are now becoming commonplace. And this is, you know, it's just a bit different than it was a few years ago for people to have protests in a lot of places where it didn't necessarily even cross your mind that somebody might drive a car into the protest. It was, I mean, you know, unless you were in Ferguson in 2014. But you know, speaking of Ferguson in 2014, one of the things I noticed was that the Michael Brown's family had requested that there be no police escort from the homecoming to the burial, and the police you know, honored that request. And the escort was a whole bunch of guys on motorcycles on Harleys, and I don't know if that group was related to the group you were talking about from Camden. If it was
No, I'm not.
no.
I'm not sure what organization that was, but you know, there's black bikers. You know, biker culture is divided up into a few different, you know, sects, and one is there's what the old school outlaws would call motorcycle enthusiasts. So that's like 99% of people who enjoy riding motorcycles. And then you have the 1%, you know, and this comes from a historic event where there was a huge rally and a bunch of, you know, wild motorcyclists tore things up. And so the police response to the media was that the 99% of the people at that rally were decent law-abiding citizens, but 1% of them were outlaws. So ever since that phrase was coined, those who identify with the 1% culture are known as outlaws, and outlaws have motorcycle. There's actually an outlaw motorcycle club called the Outlaws, but outlaw they're really worldwide. There are thousands of outlaw motorcycle clubs, or another term for them is 1%ers. Within the 1% world in the United States, there are black 1% clubs. You know, most major cities are going to have at least one black, but there are numerous black 1% clubs. And of the black, it's funny because the white 1% clubs are the dominant ones that we usually hear about in the media and that are popular part of American folklore. Hell's Angels, the Banditos, the Mongols, the Pagans. You know, those guys have historically not allowed members of color to be in their organization. I think the Mongols were predominantly Latino. So they're at this point their membership can be white or Latino. But in the United States, 1% white 1% clubs that were dominant weren't going to let, it was in their bylaws, they weren't going to let black people ride with them. And so black clubs formed their own clubs. And a handful of black clubs actually didn't have racial laws. They were like, anybody can ride with us as long as you commit to the charter in the way that we say is required. And so there are clubs that are predominantly black that also have riders of other races in them, even white riders. So that said, I'm not sure who the club in Ferguson was. And the political, outlaw biker culture is a subculture that is largely apolitical, but we know that apolitical is actually a political choice, right?
Yeah.
And so, when what we're used to seeing in white outlaw biker culture is people who Nazi symbols, the lightning bolts, the runes, and the Iron Cross and the swastika have long been a part of that culture. And initially, when asked about it, members of the culture would say, well, a lot of us were war vets. And so this culture exploded after World War II. A lot of men were coming home from the war and looking for camaraderie, got motorcycles. And a lot of them had insignias they had taken from their time fighting Nazis. And so those insignias began to show up in their regalia, right? But there were some people would say it's just about shock value. It was just because we didn't want anyone to bother us and we wanted people to feel intimidated. And then some people were like, no, that's some white, they're actually white power. And I've seen like real white power shit. Like you're not just doing it for shock power. You're actually a member of the Ku Klux Klan and you're part of outlaw, biker culture. So I've seen all that, and I've seen black clubs, take a firm stance against that. But it's a very secretive world. So I say all this to say that you can't really know what you're getting into until you have relationships with people. But there's a lot of things that appear one way on the outside and there are reasons for that. But you're not, as an outsider, you're not just going to know. You're going to have an idea, but you can't know until you become part of that culture.
That's such great wisdom, Mike.
Yeah.
Mike, do you think there's going to be an election in November before we go? I know it's too far off, but
to be honest with you, I'm not even worried about that, man. You know, I'm worried about, you know, let's say if they're right now, it looks as if the choices are going to be either Biden or Trump. From my perspective, fuck both of them, man. Like, I know people are like, we got to get Trump out, and if you vote, if you don't vote for Biden, you're voting for Trump and all that. I'm not so much caught up in that kind of binary thinking, man. What my understanding is that, you know, for poor working class people, our movement is not about who ends up in the office. You know, the things that we have to face for our survival, the struggles we have to wage to create better lives for ourselves and for the future are grounded in different things than who's president. Now, I know that the administration and the power they have to appoint people and all that, it matters, right? The Supreme Court, it matters for years and years. The type of laws that are made that affect our everyday lives, that matters. But I don't know, David. I just can't get behind the lesser of two evils. And both of those guys they're not doing it for me. They don't do it for me, man.
Do you think that any police departments are actually going to get defunded?
I think that there's gonna be a lot of talk, and we're already starting to see the talk of revolutionary abolition of police in certain cities where it's actually on the table, and city councils start to shift to milder incremental reform, starting by taking significant, you know, figures, you know, in the millions of dollars, you know, six figures from departments. And I think departments are innumerable big cities. Their relationships with schools and universities are being severed. And so, you know, the degree to which these changes are moving towards on one end, abolition of police as an institution in this country is more of an ideological fight that I think probably still has some decades to go, honestly.
Yeah.
I think the public, if we look at the spectrum of where people's minds are about whether we need police or not and the issues of public safety, I don't think that the masses are radical enough yet for there to be enough of a critical mass of people to really sustain a radical push for abolition of police departments. So again, I think what we're going to see is more mild reform where funds will be pulled that used to be allocated for policing and then reinvested and redistributed into social services. And, you know, I'll take that.
Yeah, right.
I'll take that. That's something. But again, we see that in the face of the rebellions and the uprising in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, we see that the police are still killing people. We see that their response to the public demanding that they stop killing people is to actually fucking kill more people, you know, and that culture is not going to change anytime soon. And I think the repression, they're targeting activists in Seattle. I don't know where else they're targeting activists. We've heard of 6 different lynchings. Every time you hear of a Black person hanged in this country, it gets ruled a suicide.
Right. And they're so often they're activists yeah.
And so we, you know, those of us who have a different sense of things are starting to wonder, we have to, you know, how much the police are involved in these lynchings.
Yeah.
And how long is the repression and the backlash against people going to go on in this framework? White rage, working class white people who feel their vanishing entitlement, who become vigilantes, are they going to be protected? You know, when they go out and drive a car to a protester, or when they lose their temper and shoot somebody and say that they felt scared, Are
Well,
they going
that's
to?
traditionally always been the case, hasn't it? At so many protests, and we've both been to, where the police are always protecting the fascists and attacking the anti-fascists of whatever formations we're talking about. So they're always on the wrong side.
Exactly. And so I think we have people like us who are not fascists and who actually want to create a better world for all. We have to be careful right now. You know, we have to really be mindful of the shifting environment. And even though there's mass movements for justice, there's the people who are not interested in justice are scared to death of losing what all the generations of violence and brutality and genocide and extractive, capitalism, they're afraid of losing that. And so they're going to fight like a scared animal, and we've got to be ready for that.
Mike, I want to have you back again to talk about music next time, perhaps.
Yeah,
But this
right?
has been a wonderful conversation.
Indeed,
I
man.
even had all kinds of questions related to music ready to ask you, but we there's always too much to talk about. But yeah. Thanks so much.
It, man. Thank you so much. Have a good day, David.
You too, Mike.
All right,
Take
bye-bye.
care. And thanks for tuning in to this conversation with Mic Crenshaw. You can find this and other discussions with David in archived form in various locations, such as the Discussions with David playlist on youtube.com/drovics, at patreon.com/davidrovics, at soundcloud.com/davidrovics, and on any podcasting platform if you search for the podcast This Week with David Rovics. I have a new album out on Bandcamp, which you can stream for free, called Notes from a Failed State. The music, the live stream broadcasts, and the podcasts are all free. But if you want to support my journalistic and musical efforts, plus have access to some exclusive offerings just for patrons, please join my community supported art program, or CSA, at davidrovics.com/subscribe or patreon.com/davidrovics. Artists for Rent Control is now set up to start organizing an emergency eviction response team. Please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up. Monday's broadcast will be another in the series of weekly open mics I've been hosting under the banner of Pandemic Open Mic Mondays. If you have a song, a poem, or a rant to share, please sign up at davidrovics.com/POMM. Hope to see you again soon here in the Matrix and out on the streets. Don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.